Very warm welcome this afternoon for a 90 minutes debate on crossroads moment for the EU single market, How can Europe's greatest achievement keep moving forward? Now, you may wonder why Spirits Europe sponsoring or initiating such an event. Pretty plain obvious. I think I'm old enough to remember the last time the single market was in fashion in this town. It's been a while, but I think we're sensing that it's coming back. We're seeing the letter report. We're seeing some movement from business associations and stakeholders to call on the Commission for the next Monday to refocus. And I think it's a very important time to do so, because we've clearly seen in the last 5 years strong concerns of a refragmentation of the single market. We've put it in our political manifesto as our #1 priority, that the new Commission should refocus on a frictionless single market for food and drink products. But also the very reason is the man that's sitting in front of me and that I'll be calling on to give the opening keynote, and that is Professor Craig Parsons from the University of Oregon and Oslo. And we've been in touch, I think 4 years ago, about 4 years. You've been working on various research projects also with DG Grow colleagues on particularly comparative analysis of the single market in the EU and the US. And the hopeful message I think you will be bringing to us is that we should now is maybe a good moment for us to be slightly more proud of Europe's arguably greatest achievement. But we also need to fill this feeling good about the single market with some specific ideas of what should actually now happen next. And that's what we're going to discuss in the panel after your keynote speech. So without further ado, very warm welcome, Craig. Thanks for coming, and we're looking forward to your speech.
Well, thanks so much to Ulrich and to Carol at Spirits Europe for organizing. So I am really excited to share some research with you. So first, let's see, the actual title for my piece of this is Europeans' Remarkable Support for the Single Market in Comparative Transatlantic Perspective. I also want to say I'm spokesman for a team of people working on the Single Markets Project. Several of my colleagues are here, Trim Fjortoft, Andy Smith, and Nick Jacobs back there. And we're actually a whole team of 11 researchers across 5 countries, and we have funding from the Norwegian Research Council, which we're very grateful for. And so for a few years, we've been interviewing business people and public officials and surveying the public in the EU and the US about their views of single markets. And so let me start out by, in a slightly depressing way, observing, as Ulrich just did, that a lot of Europeans, the single market hasn't been at the top of the agenda, and a lot of Europeans actually seem fairly down on the single market these days. And there are several comprehensible reasons for that. So one is that we have low expectations about the popularity of the single market to begin with, right? So Jacques Delors, rest in peace, famously said that nobody falls in love with a single market. And the idea there is that the single market is a technical project that seems pretty abstract and distant to much of the population. And so it hasn't ever been actually hugely salient or popular, even in Jacques Delors' heyday. And so we shouldn't expect it to be too much. Now, another problem for this single market, I think, is what I call the victim of its own success argument in several ways. The single market has come remarkably far, and so the low-hanging fruit are gone, right? You got rid of a lot of barriers, especially in goods, getting to the harder stuff, moving into services, and then getting into capital markets and things. And so it's just sort of unsurprising. It's because it has gone so far that things seem difficult. Also, as a reaction to its historic success, other countries piled into it, right? And so you spread an ever more ambitious project across an ever more diverse Europe, and that makes it ever more complicated to take the next step to a deep single market. So now a third problem is a changing world, right? The single market agenda has been sidelined in some ways by other priorities. So there's security concerns, there's the green transition, there's pressures to cultivate European champions against Chinese and American digital giants. And hopefully these things are not incompatible with the single market, but they have obviously turned Europeans' eyes towards other things. So in the background of that, then additionally, is the widespread perceptions that the EU overall, and the single market in particular, governance of the single market in particular, is not super democratically accountable, right? So now we can debate how fair that perception is to the EU, but the basic problem is that the EU combines a lot of technical authority over regulation, monetary affairs, with a European Parliament that has a hard time connecting to voters, maybe for reasons that aren't its own fault, but anyway, and an unelected executive, right? And so relative to the national governments that people tend to use as their benchmarks for what democracy should look like, people see reasons to worry about the EU's technocratic power in the single market and other areas, that it's often sort of running away or running along without accountability to what most Europeans think. Okay, so now I've started out by painting a deliberately bleak picture. A single market that nobody can love, that has faded in the background, and that people worry is undemocratic. But I'm here to tell you about our research that carries some more positive implications for how we see the single market and the EU more broadly, and their support from the public. And the point of departure for all this research is a simple observation. So if you want to judge what the single market has accomplished and how should we think about whether support for it is low or not, we need some sort of expectations or benchmarks for what this kind of governing arrangement could achieve and how much support such a project might be expected to attract in democratic societies. And that's a really difficult thing to do because the EU and its single market are so unique in the world. But there is, of course, one other huge continental political arena built around a shared market, which might suggest some reference points for how we think about this, the United States. So I want to tell you now about my team's research on what the single market in Europe looks like compared to the US internal market, and what support in particular for those two internal markets looks like. Okay, and I'm going to make two big points. And I'm going to take a few minutes to make this first point before getting to the second one. The first big point is just a straightforward description of the internal market rules in the EU and the US. So European integration, as I'm sure you were taught in your master's degree in European studies or whatever you people do, was originally inspired, at least partly, by a desire to create something like a United States of Europe, and especially to imitate the vast American national market. And so given that starting point, we tend to assume that the EU is still playing catch-up to the United States in that respect, and actually probably always will be. But in terms of market governance, in terms of the rules for cross-border market access internally, that is simply wrong. Okay? The EU has already created more of a single regulatory space than exists in the American internal market. Now, that's a very big claim. I'm only going to sketch it really briefly. And let me really underscore the point that what I'm talking about here is a single market in terms of governing rules, the ability to operate, do economic activity under a single set of rules, okay, as opposed to a single market in terms of economic integration on the ground, right? In terms of flows of trade, and especially flows of personal mobility, those flows are considerably higher still in the United States. Personal mobility is something like 10 to 20% higher across 10 to 20 times higher across American states than across European countries, right? So I am claiming that the EU has more single market rules than the US, but I'll come back to that distinction about economic integration on the ground later. So now, since spiritsEUROPE is our host, and spirit sector is one that we've been studying as part of our study, let me use the spirit sector as a hook to get into broader claim about the two single markets. And with apologies to those of you who were at the spiritsEUROPE members session a little earlier, this covers a little bit of the same ground, but there it is. So spirits is not a normal goods sector, of course. It's especially highly regulated, and it's regulated in especially diverse ways. And European countries came into the EU with hugely different national traditions in spirits, hugely different regulatory arrangements, from Scandinavian monopolies to much more liberal regimes in Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, as one visualization of these differences, and you probably can't really quite see the numbers there, but it is, one of the differences that are out there. You can see immense variation in excise taxes on spirits still across the EU. They're roughly by a factor of 10. So it's like €1.50 in Bulgaria per bottle and almost 10 times that in Finland. Now, despite those varying national traditions, the EU has done a lot to construct a single market in spirits. In fact, as you all learned in your Masters of European Studies or equivalent program, the spirit sector has been central to the construction of the single market overall, precisely because the variations in it kick up a bunch of obstacles to a single market. So there's the famous Cassis de Dijon case that contributed to establishing the super important principle of mutual recognition. Most of the most influential goods laws cases in the EU actually are about spirits. And so the EU has done a lot from to building goods law through some spirits cases, and then doing things like harmonizing the rules around defining categories of drinks, forcing the Scandinavians to allow online purchasing alongside their retail monopolies, pushing some aspects of national taxation regimes to become more similar for competitive alcoholic products that are in competition with each other. And generally, tried to encourage competition across internal borders, even in this especially highly regulated sector. While, of course, still allowing lots of exceptions for generally public health justified national variations. Okay, now, given those allowances for differences in approaches to public health and other EU allowances for national variations on other grounds, there's still all sorts of important ways in which the EU doesn't have a completely single market in spirits by any means. Variations in advertising rules, and of course the Scandinavian monopolies and some labeling stuff, the Irish cancer warning, which is a big thing right now. Right, there's a bunch of things out there. But so overall, you can say that if we look at spirits, this is a difficult sector. It's an especially difficult sector for single market openness, but nonetheless a sector that has been very substantially impacted by the single market project. Now, shift to the United States. So as you may know, remember at some point, have been learned at some point, so after the American experiment with prohibition ended in 1933, they basically resolved the big political fights around that by agreeing to disagree with the 21st Amendment to the American Constitution, which gave states special authority over alcohol regulation, allowing them to regulate it in different ways. And that led to roughly the same variations in American alcohol regimes that you had in Europe prior to the EU beginning its work. So you have three kinds of states. The green ones are mostly liberalized, although still with a fair number of funky rules. The orange ones are called control states. These are public monopolies for spirits, and some of them are also public monopolies for wine or beer, so it's like a Scandinavian monopoly. You can only buy spirits in public stores. The red ones are this is peculiarly American invention called franchise states, where it's private actors who are doing the selling and distribution, but they're extremely tight and also extremely varied laws about who can distribute and how. The competition it does all sorts of weird things to competition or the lack thereof. Anyway, so you have these massively different regimes within the United States at the state level. There are some products even that can be sold in one state and not others. There are all sorts of complex variations in how you can promote and market your products. There's some variation in recycling requirements. There's also, since I put up the European excise taxes, so again, these numbers are a little small for you to see, but so the highest excise tax in the United States is in Washington State, $33. Here it's gallons, it's bottles on the European side, but anyway. Up to $33 a gallon versus the gray ones, Wyoming and New Hampshire, are states with zero excise tax. Okay, so mathematically that's an infinite multiple of variation, but actually, more seriously, it's sort of half the range of variation that you see across European countries, which is still quite a lot. My notes just made a jump. So, the US comes into the mid-20th century with variation in its states-level spirits regulation that is much like the variation in European countries' regulations. But the really big difference, if you look at the spirit sector today in the US compared to Europe, is that the US has not had a single market project that did anything to change this. Okay, they haven't even tried to seriously facilitate trade across these varying state regimes. So, there is an agency in the Federal Treasury, the Tax and Trade Bureau, the TTB, that plays an important role in it. You have to register with it to place spirits on the market, and they homogenize labels. But that's not part of any sort of coherent policy to have a single market. It's just a process by which the federal government is able to tax alcohol. Okay, so and there's basically nobody else in the federal government who tries to nudge the states in any significant way to make it easier to essentially have markets, state markets that are any more similar, or for which access across them is easier. So my research team has talked to federal officials at the TTB and also at other potentially relevant federal agencies like the Federal Trade Commission. And if you ask them, do you people ever do anything to make it easier to sell spirits across the states, or can you imagine doing that? They say that's not relevant. That's not our job. We don't do that. That's up to the states. You know, just it's like a total disinterest. It's not our institutional role. Okay, now the overall variation in American regulation in alcohol, then, and the costs that producers run into in selling across these varied jurisdictions hasn't decreased much since the mid-20th century. And when my team interviews spirits producers, as we have on both sides of the Atlantic, it's very common for the Americans to tell us that it is at least as hard or harder to sell into the next US state as it is to sell abroad into other countries. Now, there may be some people in the room, however, who are getting impatient with how I'm talking about this, because it sounds like I'm suggesting that there's something amazing about a lack of change in American regulation of spirits. And I already told you that we have this 21st Amendment to the Constitution that gives the states these powers. And so you might just think, oh, well, there's this special American history of prohibition and a special constitutional amendment, and so this is a sector. Sure, well, of course, it's been really hard to change, and so people haven't touched it. But here's the broader point, having used spirits as a hook to get into this, that I want to make about the US side of this comparison. And that is that the lack of attention to interstate commerce and state-level barriers in the spirit sectors is not by any means limited to that weird sector. It is a weird sector. What's not weird about it is that nobody is interested in single market stuff in it. And that mainly reflects the fact that the United States, despite especially a common European image of the United States as a sort of market paradise, has quite weak single market rules in general. And so if we look at many other sectors, we see that many of them also have regulation that is quite fragmented and decentralized. Not quite as much as in spirits. It is an extreme case, but it's an extreme case in the European single market too, right? And so the fact is that the modern United States has not had anything like Europe's single market project. And as a result, today, it's unambiguously true that across overall, American states have more authority to exclude goods and services from their markets than EU member states do from their neighboring states. So spirits is an example of that, not an exception. Now, I need to convince you of that big claim a little bit more. And I could go on for a very long time, but for now I'm going to try and make that point mainly just by telling you one other story. And it's about a Supreme Court case that was decided in May of last year. So in the progressive, groovy state of California, voters a while back passed referendum setting standards for animal rights, which included raising the standards for processes for raising pigs acceptably to place pork on the California market. Now, an interesting fact is that California has almost no pig farming at all in it. They don't make their own pork in California. They get it from elsewhere. But they were regulating that you could only sell pork in California if you raised it in certain ways. Now, the United States does have rules in its constitution that might seem to limit California's ability to do that. There's the Commerce Clause, which is seen widely by historians as the main reason why the US Constitution was written. Okay, it's a very important clause, and it gave power to regulate interstate commerce to the federal government and specifically to Congress. So, the National Pork Producers Association, which is mostly a bunch of pig farmers from Iowa, took California to court and argued that it didn't have the authority to regulate pork production in Iowa. That's a federal responsibility. And to make a long story short, they lost. And really interestingly, and I'd love to talk more about this if you want to hear more about it, both the most liberal and the most conservative judges agreed on this case, upholding the California law. Now, this was a very significant case that strengthened states' rights to regulate as they please. But at the same time, it wasn't actually a giant departure from previous American jurisprudence. Ever since the early 20th century, US states have generally had pretty wide autonomy to regulate access to their markets. So now, let's make a contrast to what it's like in the EU. So you may know that Austria stands out for especially strong animal welfare laws in Europe. But those Austrian laws, due to the structure of EU single market law, only apply to Austrian producers, right? States are allowed to set higher requirements for their own producers, but they can't keep out pork or eggs or whatever that are coming from other EU member states, if assuming those products meet general EU requirements. So this is a great example of what I mean when I say that the EU has stronger rules for single market openness than the US, right? US law directly authorizes state-level actions that would be ruled out quite strongly and unambiguously as single market barriers in Europe. Now, of course, everyone in this room knows that Europe's stronger rules don't play out perfectly on the ground. There are all sorts of implementation and enforcement problems for this actually quite small European Union thing across a huge and diverse continent. There are problems with gold plating, right, where higher member states' requirements end up effectively being perhaps like California's pork requirements there. And then also the Commission, as Ulrich mentioned, has stepped back in some ways in recent years from infringements and sort of really aggressive enforcement. Nonetheless, it's still a different kind of single market from the American one, where many barriers like these are explicitly authorized and legitimated, and no one even talks about changing them. Okay, so in many good sectors, American states have broad powers to set their own requirements. In most services, states have essentially unlimited rights to set conditions for licensing of their of service professionals, even when it's entirely duplicative. In public procurement or state aids, Americans have rock solid and essentially unlimited rights to favor their own citizens and firms. That's actually true. Okay. Okay. Now this all sums up. There's a lot more to be said about that, but this sums up to my first big hopeful point, which is, whoops. Oh no, my notes here keep jumping around. Apologies. Which is that. Where are my notes? Okay, so in terms of constructing single market rules for openness, Europe is actually now ahead of the United States in many ways. And that's an amazing accomplishment, especially given the vastly greater diversity of this continent relative to the United States. Okay, but now let me turn to the really cool stuff, which is my second big hopeful point. And so our research showcases an even more remarkable comparison when you look at political support for an open single market. So if you ask Europeans and Americans the same kinds of questions about the governance of their respective single markets, the single market and the EU come out looking really good. All right, we did this survey. We wanted to know what the public also, not just business elites and public officials, think about the single market. So we designed a first-of-its-kind survey, and it asked more questions about all aspects of single market issues and governance than anyone has ever done. And of course, nobody's ever done such a survey where they're trying to ask the same kinds of questions in the US and Europe. So we have 11 countries in Europe that are involved with that. I'm only going to talk about the results for the EU members, which are the 8 ones you see there. Okay, but we have a whole lot of responses and good statistical leverage and all that. Okay, so let me show you some of this. I want to focus in on a few key questions that are directly about support for single market goals, and then also for the EU or the federal government in the US. So here are the raw results for 3 such questions, right? So we asked people on a 7-point scale to agree or disagree with. To have a thriving economy, firms must be allowed to do business freely. To have a thriving economy, people must be allowed to move freely across the US to the EU. And then whether you like the idea of the US federal government or the EU doing more to make trade easier. Okay, now, a first observation, right, is just look at the raw numbers. And I think most people will be surprised. We would tend to assume that Americans would think it quite normal and desirable for businesses or people to move around in the US, and that Europeans would be at least a little more skeptical of that. But it's actually very, very similar, okay? So you have essentially 80% of Europeans, and so these numbers are strongly agree or fair, right? What was it, Nick? What's the strong, mostly agree? Or somewhat agreed with this. Okay. Anyway, it's surprisingly similar to the United States in raw numbers. But then it gets really interesting when we break this down in a statistical model with some controls. Okay. So here we have a model that we're going to talk about tomorrow at a DG Grow conference. To be technical, it's a mixed effects hierarchical model in which we're asking how much those responses vary with certain attributes. And we're still playing around with what should be on the list of controls up there on some level. But we have lots of things that might conceivably affect how people see single market policies and authority. How wealthy they are, how wealthy their state or country is, the level of inequality, their age, education, how conservative they are. We have a question about whether they think immigration is good or bad for your country. And so the statistical thing that's going on here, right, is essentially the closer the points are to the 0 line, the less we see systematic variation across all the responses. And this is in both the EU and the US as a whole sample, okay, with that particular condition. Now, what we're really trying to get at with this model is, once we account for how much those responses vary with all those other controls and attributes, are there still any differences that it makes to be a resident of the EU versus a resident of the United States? And that's the bottom line with the big red arrow, okay? And so now the circle, okay, with a confidence interval around it, suggests, okay, that among all respondents, just being a resident of Europe makes you 20-some% more likely to agree with firms must be allowed to do business freely across the polity. It makes you a similar number more likely to agree, surprisingly, with personal mobility, okay, on the right. If you then break it down to just those parts of our respondents who report working for a firm that does business in either another US state or another European country, the effect is much larger, okay? So both those numbers, there's more support, and that doesn't seem super surprising, right? People who work in single market related jobs are especially supportive. Okay, now, oh yeah, so here's the one, the third question that I posed there. Okay, so about directly asking people, do you agree that the EU or the federal government should do more to make things easier, to make trade easier? So now let me remind you that my previous big point means this is not a silly question to ask in the United States. There is work to be done that you could do to make it easier. There are interstate barriers in the United States, right? So there's stuff that could be done. But when you ask Americans and you control for all that stuff, here the effects are even bigger, right? What we're seeing here is about a 60-some% effect. Europeans controlling for everything else. Being a European makes you 60% more likely to agree with this proposition. Okay, that seems like some pretty remarkably robust evidence of support for the single market in Europe. Now I'm going to show you one more chart, and I'm almost done here, which has some questions that aren't specifically single market related, but about how people see the EU more generally relative to how Americans see the federal government. Okay, now this one's a little different from the previous chart. My circles and triangles or whatever squares in the previous one were for different groups. Here, they are for different questions. And if you look down at the bottom, right, so we're asking people to agree with what versions of, does the EU generally have good intentions, okay, or the federal government? We ask, does the EU or the federal government generally make things better? And then we asked, and this is my favorite, citizens have a lot of influence over what the EU does or what the federal government does, okay? And now here the political controls up top are, a bunch of political views are having some effect, right? They're varying up there. So there's some interesting politics going on up in there that we will eventually dig into more. But still, when you control for all that, right, look at the red arrow and down at the bottom, and here's what we're seeing there. The effect of being an EU resident relative to being a US resident makes you more than 50% more likely to say that your central governing institutions, the EU, have good intentions. The effect is about 35% with views about whether the EU or the US federal government makes things better. And the effect is even, and this is my favorite, 25% or so with views about whether citizens have a lot of influence over the EU versus the federal government. And that last one is really striking, because I have to say, even though I'm pretty, pro-European, and I think the EU is a good thing, but as far as I can tell, that's simply wrong. I think probably Americans do have more influence over their federal government than European citizens do have over the EU. I mean, we do have elections. They're screwy and weird in the United States, but we do have elections, right? And so it's just remarkable that Europeans say, much more so than Americans, that they think they have influence over the EU. So to conclude, then, let me try to give you a few takeaways, and this is just a silly slide about takeaways. So let me suggest a tiny bit about what I think these observations imply for the single market and the EU now. So if you hope to see the single market flourish, and you hope to sell it to the broader population, I think that pro-single market circles of policy elites would do well to sort of adjust their prevailing negative discourse and analysis of where the project stands, right? Now, I don't want to come across as naively optimistic or Pollyannish, if you know that expression in English, because of course the single market has moved off the agenda and faces significant challenges and opposition. But if we step back and consider what is achieved, no polity, not the United States and not Canada or Australia or any other federation, has ever tried to institutionalize equally ambitious principles of internal market openness, let alone across such a diverse arena, much, much more diverse than any national federation, with far more powerful subunits, right? And once you see how extraordinary that project is, the resistance and changes that it has encountered in the past 10 to 15 years seem a lot more comprehensible, I think, right? If you pursue the most ambitious single market principles ever, and you push that project in an unusually general way that extends even into especially challenging sectors like spirits or services sectors, and you do that while you're expanding your membership across a big diverse continent of old sovereign states, of course you're going to find it harder and harder to keep that project rolling forward, right? I mean, that doesn't make it easier, but it does, it's sort of comforting, right? This is not, most of what we're looking at in Europe is not some sort of giant, amazing upswell of opposition to a project. It is the predictable result of trying to pull off what the EU is trying to pull off. So now, despite the remarkably ambitious nature of what has already been achieved and what is attempted here, right, our survey suggests that you, the European policy elite, if I may, have brought the European population along more than you realize. So we've asked these questions in all sorts of ways, and it tends to come out near to this sort of 80% number of people who are willing to agree with the goals of the single market and doing more to achieve them. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that Europeans are deeply converted to neoliberal open market beliefs, and if you ask the questions in different ways, you'd get different things, right? But it does imply that there is on the terrain of sort of single market goals per se, there is a reservoir of European support where people seem to be interpreting this as sort of good governance. Now, after that cheerleading, let me make a point that is implied by what I've said so far, but which is more about the limits of what the single market can achieve. And then I have one more slide after this, and then I really am done. Okay, so I've told you that in a regulatory sense of rules, the EU already has a more complete single market than the US. But I noted at the beginning that the US still has considerably higher flows of trade and mobility across its internal borders. Now, both sides of that comparison teach us something about the limited relationship between single market rules and regulatory change and the economic fluidity that those rules are designed to achieve. So the US has high flows despite fragmented regulation, presumably for social reasons of shared identity and language, and also due to strong American norms of mobility per se. The EU has crafted remarkably open rules for cross-border market access, but the payoff for that project in economic fluidity is limited by social fragmentation and also much more limited norms of mobility. Even inside EU countries, people don't move around as much, right? So that implies that even if you do succeed at continuing to pursue the single market re-regulation project, it isn't ever going to create an economy as fluid as the American one, at least not in any normal policy time frame. French business people are never going to feel as comfortable in Poland as Californians feel in Florida, despite Ron DeSantis. And that's surely okay, right? Polish and French people don't want to become homogenized Europeans for the most part, but for champions of the single market, it does mean that going forward, you have to be careful about exaggerating what the single market can deliver. All right, lastly, let me sum up what those two preceding slides together imply as we look towards the European Parliament elections and beyond. Now, I'll remind you that I'm a political science professor, not a campaign consultant. My colleagues and I do research to understand the big, deep context for policy and politics, and if you want specific advice on political messaging and campaigns, there are better people in this room for that. But with that caveat, I'd say that our research implies the broad advice that you see here, right? Try a positive message that celebrates a remarkable single market that shouldn't be taken for granted, not it's incomplete and there's ever more to do, which is a negative leading message. Be confident that messaging about the core single market goals of a continent open to itself has remarkably wide support, if you can get at that message, right? Now, given how far the single market has come, and that this means further steps get harder, have already gotten harder, focus the single market agenda on a few priority elements to advance, and also the most important priority elements to consolidate or defend, because you do need to do that too. And then essentially present that agenda as a program for reasonable good governance in prosperous societies, or hoping to be prosperous societies, without overselling it as the solution to all of Europe's ills. Okay, I will end there, turn things over to our great set of panelists, all of whom are less academic and hopefully more concrete than I am, and I'm looking forward to hearing their specific suggestions on how to keep the single market moving forward. Thanks.
Craig, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that. Some excellent insights into how the EU has been remarkably successful in enforcing some of these very strong principles of internal market openness and persuading citizens to support its single market project, and particularly vis-a-vis our American cousins as well. It's interesting to have this compare and contrast approach. From my perspective, it's really is a pleasure to be here this evening and to be moderating this event. My name is Glenn Hodson. I'm the CEO and founder of Free Trade Europe, a think tank. And promoting the importance of the EU single market is an issue very close to my own heart personally, and constitutes one of the 5 main pillars of our EU manifesto. And as Craig very rightly said, for the next part of this event, I would like to introduce you all to our distinguished expert panel. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the Director of Internal Market at Business Europe, Martinez Barisas. Then the Director General of Food Drink Europe, Dirk Jacobs. And the Director at the European Centre for International Political Economy, ESIPE, Frederick Eriksson. And last, but by, of course, no means least, the Policy Coordinator in the European Commission at DG GROW, Alexei Trofimov. Welcome to the panel, gentlemen. In terms of the format, each panelist will have 4 to 5 minutes to present their introductory thoughts and a few key messages before we... 4 minutes. Oh, Carol decides, not me. There we go. 4 to 5. Introductory thoughts and also some of the key messages that we want to present before moving on to kind of a moderated discussion. And then there will also be opportunity for questions from the floor as well to the panelists, but also to go back to Craig's presentation as well. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to Martinez to kick things off.
Thanks. Does it work? Yes. Thanks, Glenn, and good evening, everyone. And thanks, Craig, for a kind of provocative presentation, which is interesting. So it's let's give it a go. And well, first of all, maybe what I got from your research is that you are delivering a positive message here to Europe, to Europeans, that we are kind of receptive of what the single market is and what the free trade is, kind of better than the Americans are. That's encouraging, so I want to take this encouraging message and also to the officials from the Commission sitting here. So that means there is a support for the idea, there is a support for concept, and we then have to do something. But now to throw a little bit of salt on all this, of course, because I come from the business community. Business Europe is a cross-sectoral organization. I'll not go into spirits, maybe later in the evening. But overall, how we see things with the single market over the last years, and to be very honest, we don't see things well. We kind of have observed stagnation, if not a rollback, when it comes to the single market integration in Europe. And that is actually related to the way Europe regulates, and and that's what's behind the single market concept. You know, you mentioned the one set of rules, and that was a very interesting distinction, Craig, that you have to distinguish between one set of rules under which you operate from the actual economic integration. That is a question of public acceptance, we would say, and if we see that economic laws, which are a single set of rules for Europe, they don't deliver economic convergence and welfare to the citizens, then we have a bit of an issue of acceptance. At the same time, it was interesting to hear that you see that Europeans are still very positive. So there is a fine line, and that has a lot to do with the public acceptance. I can throw lots of figures, but since we have 4 minutes, so maybe I'll cut it short. But very simple figures that we have on the table is, the cross-border trade in goods since 2006, I think it grew by 3.5% only. Cross-border service trade in Europe, I think it reaches hardly the 6% of European GDP. So we are not there with the potential. We also have figures that, mere removal of cross-border regulatory barriers within the EU would potentially generate additional 713 billion euro tax-free neutral, taxpayer neutral money. That's a lot, and these things are not happening. And we have also the figures of the last quarters of last year in terms of GDP growth in Europe, where we see that the engine of European economy, the single market, is not delivering, and that's an issue. I'll stop maybe here. We as Business Europe, we have 37 recommendations on the way forward. In a nutshell, it's about governance of single market, so that's implementation, enforcement of what exists. This is also about the way we regulate, if we decide so the intervention of the market, how it should be done. And last but not least, it's about the role of businesses and public-private partnership that has to be there behind the single market project. So I'll stop here for now.
Excellent, Martinez. Thank you very much indeed. Dirk, you can take things there, because I don't want to get in trouble with Carol in terms of time.
Nobody wants to get in trouble with Carol. So I will stick to the time, Carol. So thank you very much. I think food and drink, which I represent, is one of the most tangible benefits and assets of the single market. There's a very nice clip that I saw recently on YouTube where a supermarket in Germany, I believe, showed what it would mean if there would only be national products on the supermarket shelves. And it showed almost an empty supermarket there. That was in response to some of the nationalist and populist claims in Germany. So that already shows the value. And I think often, like, I don't really like the term single market, because it presumes that we are all doing exactly the same. I also don't really like the internal market, because we are an open economy. We are trading across the world. So I think we need to rebrand the single or the internal market and call it something like a power market, or I don't know. If you have a better suggestion, let me know. But I think diversity is the first benefit that we definitely need to identify more. But also security. In the last couple of crises that we've been facing, be it on the pandemic, be it the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, it always comes back to keeping supply chains running, keeping borders open. And it's not only about goods, it's also about workers, it's about services, it's about the whole ecosystem that needs to be running. And I think critical supply chains, I think that will be a goal in itself to make sure that the single market can function in that sense. For us, from an economic point of view, 84% of food and drink turnover is made in the single market. It's almost 1 trillion of euros annually that is generated. And again, when we were confronted with Brexit, there's this famous creamy milk liquor that had to travel across the border 6 times before it is finalized in the product. That shows how important cross-border trade and the single market is in that sense. But also from a diplomatic point of view, Europe as a bloc, as a geopolitical bloc in a geopolitically changing world, is going to be ever more important. So these are already sort of showing, I think it's a no-brainer that the single market should be enhanced and strengthened, and that we need to preserve it. And unfortunately, indeed, I concur that over the last years we have seen a deterioration of the attention to the single market, but also the implementation and execution. We see more gastro-nationalism in our area, more countries that go on their own. Saw it even very recently where French farmers were spilling wine that were coming from Spain in protest of imports between different countries. And that's already a sign that we need to be very careful with that. So we have divergent rules in labeling, in packaging, and we don't seem to be learning from it. So there's a lot of words being told about how important the single market is, and you have the report of Mr. Letta that is coming. So European leaders, I think, all are in agreement on paper that the single market is absolutely critical. But then we don't see it back in the actions. When we talk about packaging legislation right now, it's a fragmented approach. When it talks about labeling and health warning labels and what have you, it's not going in the right direction. So when the single market was 25 years old, 6 years ago, we made this leaflet, a single market, for a single market with a purpose. Because the single market is a tool, it's not the goal in itself, it needs to have a purpose. So we need to identify what do we want to achieve with that single market. And everything that is in there, and I had just a check, is still very relevant today in terms of our policy recommendations. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, but we need to bring it back on track. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Dirk. Frederick, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Glenn, and thanks also to Craig for a very good presentation. I wish we had time to go in to have a discussion about the American example or the European example and compare them, because I think it's actually quite clarifying also from an economic perspective, just to think through how different institutions, especially different constitutional experiences, will also have consequences for how quite mundane things like conformity assessment bodies are sort of designed and operated in different jurisdictions. I think my point would be that when we're talking about the single market, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we want to achieve? We have that whole credo going back I think to sort of the French economic thinker Frédéric Bastiat, but of course it became much more popular after the Second World War, which is that if goods don't cross borders, armies will. And ever since then, we have placed a premium on building the connectivity, creating mutual dependencies in order to achieve much more peaceful outcomes, and making it more costly in order to raise conflicts with each other. So that's been a goal. And I think it's been an extraordinarily successful achievement in that sense, if we look at it, what we wanted to achieve with many of the economic policies we had. If I would look at it as an economist, that wouldn't be the first thing I would be looking at. And it certainly wouldn't be the first thing I would be looking at today, because fortunately, I don't think there is a risk of armed conflict between European nations anymore. I would look at many other different things, like, for instance, the speed of diffusion of new technologies, how quickly that new goods are being introduced at markets, how adoption rates of different services look like in different countries. And I would be trying to figure out sort of the capacity in a single market construct in order to help that, in order to diffuse things as fast as possible across borders. Because an economy which thrives so much on technology and technological change, that's going to be absolutely crucial for how much productivity, how much change, and ultimately how much prosperity you can help to deliver through these types of economic connectivities. And here I would say that the single market has been successful in some parts, but not so successful in other parts. And if we start to compare with America, I think we're looking at two very, very different examples where diffusion is so much faster in America than it is in Europe. And we can ask ourselves why. Well, partly because a lot of these things aren't about trade specifically. They're about much other things. It's about investment, and whether you have large companies that are invested across borders and run operations in several countries. It is about the extent to which that you're going to have some degree of unification of labor, which means that the introduction of one thing in one country is easily imitated in another country. Sort of all these sort of stuffs. And here I think we have some problems in Europe. And I think the problems have been exacerbated by a regulatory drive that we've seen over the last, I'd say, 15, 20 years in Europe, which has, in my view, gone too far and led us into this illusory thinking, which is that we can regulate faster, harder, and deeper than any other comparable economies in the world without suffering economic consequences for it. And I think one of the consequences we are finding is on these cross-border connectivity when it comes to really new stuff that is being introduced in the markets. So just to set up my stall very quickly, so I think there is a strong case to be made for more single market and single market reforms in Europe. Perhaps you shouldn't call it single market, but I think you know what I mean. I think there is a very strong case for sort of pausing this holiday from economic reality that we've had in Europe for the last 5 years, thinking that all these things don't matter really, that there is always sort of a purse of money somewhere that we can sprinkle on companies or governments and boom, the economy is going to thrive again. Try to rejuvenate this sort of spirit which I think has been strong in Europe for many decades, which is that bottom-up economic growth, that we need to have more entrepreneurship, more competition, etc. I'd like to see more of that. And I also like to see us being much more connected to world markets as well. Already now, I mean, 90% of all global growth in the world happens outside the European Union, and that figure is not going to change in a way which is favorable to the European Union for obvious reasons. So if we want to be even better at connecting with new growth in the world economy, we need to find ways to connect with these markets through trade agreements. And right now, we don't have a trade policy in the European Union, which is quite remarkable if you know sort of where we come from and the crucible of the Second World War for the formation of the European project. That's what I'm going to say tonight, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Fredrik. Alexei, please, perspective from the European Commission here.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? Excellent. You know, when we speak about the single market from the perspective of the European Commission, we usually start by really insisting on what a success the single market actually is and how far we have come. And so for me, it's very refreshing that on this occasion, I want to thank Professor Parsons for his very insightful analytical contribution. He has already made the case that, in fact, we have really integrated the single market a great deal in comparison with our largest peer, the United States. I have all kinds of figures showing that if we take the helicopter view of the single market, then we see these curves of trade integration in goods, but also in services going up. And the work, of course, has not stopped. Just a few days ago, as some of you may know, there was a political agreement reached on the single market emergency instrument, a new way of ensuring that in a situation of crisis, the single market will continue to function. We're also right now working, putting the last finishing touches on the annual single market and competitiveness report, which will be published in a few days. It will be a communication from the Commission outlining the developments in the single market. And so in that perspective, I would like to outline 3 areas where the Commission sees at the moment the most important attention needs to be paid. So first of all, of course, it's the barriers in the single market. Work on the removing of barriers continues. And indeed, in our Commission communication from 2020, we made a catalog of barriers, and we concluded that compared to the situation 20 years prior, around 2/3 of the barriers still remain. And I link back to what you said, that many barriers still remain also according to your analysis. This is also our view, and so in that sense, we are working, of course, with member states to tackle those barriers, and it is very important that there is a co-ownership between the European Commission and other institutions and member states. So one way to do it that we see is the work in the single market enforcement task force, where we map various areas and obstacles that exist, and where literally hundreds of tiny barriers have been tackled or removed. And of course, we continue with the enforcement policy that we have, and we look at the administrative burden. Now, coming to the administrative burden, of course, President von der Leyen took the commitment to reduce reporting obligations by 25%, and I can tell you that inside the Commission there is a lot of work that is going on, looking at the cumulative burden that companies face and trying to find areas of synergy. But quite apart from just removing legislation, which sometimes is not possible, another way of achieving this objective is through making reporting simpler and easier. And of course, digitalization offers great opportunities in this respect. under the single digital gateway regulation, there are already a list of procedures that need to be digital already today. And now we're working also on the once-only technical solution that will allow member state administration to exchange documents at the request of persons or individuals, which will again make it easier to comply with requirements in our single market. And finally, the last point that I will make is that in the ever-changing, quickly changing world, digital and green transition, we also need to sustain the business case in the single market and ensure predictability of business conditions. And so for that reason, we put forward predictability of critical raw materials, for example, the CRMA Act. We try to ensure predictability of components, CHIPS Act. We try to ensure predictability in the case of crisis, single market emergency instrument, which is now called IMERA. So the work continues, but of course we are very open to new ideas, and so we're looking forward to ideas that will come from the two upcoming reports, the Letta report and the Draghi report.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed. And there's a lot of food for thought there from our panelists. So if we can maybe open this up, given the fact we have the June elections almost upon us, and how could this compelling single market narratives be really integrated into the European election campaigns? We heard at the start of the discussions here that it's impossible to fall in love with a single market, but some of the benefits have been forgotten to a certain extent. So how can we address this and change the situation? Martinez, do you want to kick us off and maybe say a little bit about this? What would you be doing?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, lots of thoughts having heard colleagues on the panel. But I will start maybe with what Frederick was talking about. And that's about diffusion of technologies. And first of all, yeah, we have to ask a question and explain to people what do technologies bring to them? What societal benefits are there from the technologies? And then, of course, we speak about the scaling up and diffusion of technologies at the best price possible and at the fastest pace possible. And here we come to the single market, right? And for us at Business Europe, it's very interesting now to see in the coming years if the massive regulations that came, for example, in the area of digital will actually deliver on the technology uptake and diffusion to the society to benefit from these technologies. Very simple thing. I mean, of course, it's not about the latest regulations, but those which are already in place. But we see the Digital Economy and Society Index, and it says that technology uptake by the society and companies has been the lowest among all the other indicators. For us, this is a sign that something is not working. So some single market rules on digital are not delivering the result. Let's see after this term of the Commission with lots of regulations again on the table if these new regulations will deliver. And we need to validate that on the ground. So that's one thing. And for me, it relates, I mean, I like putting this, as a joke that, we have the ambition in Europe to be the leaders in technology, to have a necessary scale to lead in AI, for example, but we still have a problem of a juice package. So, and I'm talking about packaging regulation. So we very much hope that Europe will be capable to have political agreements on the juice packages so that we can really be sure that we can deliver on AI. But that's just a joke. In terms of what to do, again, and I wanted to bring one more example, what we are speaking loud within our membership, of course, is the potential of the single market for services. And I mean, no big news. Again, 60% of the barriers in the single market in the area of services come from 20 years ago. And we know that it's, in a way, a clash of religions when we speak about liberalization of services in Europe. But what we can do maybe, and what we are trying to put on the table as a suggestion, maybe to look into the services which actually can bring the member states with strong industrial manufacturing base together with those providing the services more. And we speak, of course, first of all, about the services which are inputs and creating value added also in the manufacturing sector. And a very interesting comparison with the US, by the way. we saw quite an interesting study from Copenhagen Economics that actually the European manufacturing industry is much more servitized compared to the US. So 27% of the value added in the manufacturing of Europe comes from services sector compared to 20% in the US. So we are much more servitized. At the same time, the productivity gap is very big. So we are probably twice as lower compared to the US. Super big potential for both service providers and manufacturers in Europe, which is not used due to the lack of political will. So again, this probably has to be communicated in a way that would be acceptable to society at large, to explain how they can benefit from the generate welfare from these liberalization attempts, and maybe we can make it with the next cycle. And last but not least, the governance. I mentioned the governance. I mean, we definitely think that if the EU rules don't bring tangible results on the ground, it's a question of acceptance by public. It's a question of the rule of law, and it's a question of the whole project, the European project. So we do think that the European Commission should be a real watchdog of the treaties, be much more proactive when it comes to infringements against the member states. Again, we have the figures. I think it's FT who threw these figures of comparison that infringement cases fell radically by 80% between 2020 2022 in Europe compared to the respective periods before. That is a worrying sign. We need to depoliticize the non-compliance of member states with the EU single market rules, and then we hope to get things moving in the right direction.
Excellent. Well, Dirk, can you follow that up? I mean, going on from this sort of the governance piece, but also diffusion of technology, the pace and price, which of course is important in here. What are the thoughts that you have on this?
Well, I think it's time for a bit of a new narrative, and particularly with the elections, there's a momentum for that, and that's not to say that now in the next couple of months we can do a campaign on promoting the single market and think that we're done. In fact, we are already at a sort of at a loss, at a sort of there's a lot of catching up to do because of in the last 5 years we haven't really seen a lot of promotion of the single market, and we actually have seen a lot of counterproductive activities where the member states have to be blamed for a part, where also the Commission has sometimes not taken up its role as guardian of the treaty, where we also as an industry or as a chain have sometimes given conflicting messages as well, so we have to also look at ourselves. So it is not going to be an easy one, but there is now a moment in time that we can reflect on Green Deal and what have you, and look forward with a much more common vision. And that common vision, in our view, is something that is backed by investment, that looks at speed of technology and innovation. How can we improve that? How can we have a more comprehensive trade policy? How do we practically go about better regulation and have a much more positive narrative? Because also, like if you talk to a regular person on the street, and maybe not here in Brussels, but somewhere on the countryside of Slovakia or in Sweden or wherever it is, they are not dealing with single market. They probably have not heard at all of single market at all, but they want to know what are the tangible benefits, what is the value that they get out of it. They don't want to be ripped of their rights, or at least have the feeling that they are having less and less to spend, or less and less to get from authorities. So if you turn that around, and can we give consumers, can we give citizens, can we give businesses more through strengthening the single market? I think that's a way how we can make that a little bit sort of that narrative change and depolarize, as you also said, this discussion, which appears to be right now in that context.
So, Frederick, stop the backsliding, make it more tangible. Is this the key?
Possibly. I think I was going to do exactly what Craig did, which is to take a rain check on the political messaging consultancy part of it, and point to other people sort of about going into the European election, what's going to happen then. I don't think anything to say about that, but just a couple of observations on my point, which relates to the single market. So I think the first one is a very core part of the single market is state aid rules. And this is becoming visible around Europe. I can hear it talking about sort of when I go as a tourist in different parts of Europe and people complaining about unfairness. Unfairness that if you belong to a company that have huge fiscal space to put government resources into industrial projects, these companies get money. If you are in a country that don't have that fiscal space, you don't get any money. And when we, of course, look at the volumes of state aid over the last couple of years, we're beginning to see a pattern which I think may prompt some pretty sort of difficult developments over the next couple of years. I wouldn't at all be surprised that we're going to have an EU state imposing a trade restriction on another EU state in, say, the next 5 or 10 years, because they believe that products from the other country is so subsidized that you can't compete on fair terms. When we see how this is transplanting, especially into sort of industries with green profiles, if you look, for instance, at things like the steel sector, aluminum sector, what some factories or some production units now get in support from government if you say you're German, compared to if you're Italian. It sort of, I don't really see sort of how you're going to maintain and have a straight face saying sort of that fairness exists and we can have sort of free trade internally in Europe if the degree of subsidization is going to be so vastly different as the figures now suggest they're going to be. So that would be my first point. My second point would be that we do have a lot of big ambitions which have been also anchored in what I would say are sort of good policies at the EU level over the last years, especially if you look at the European Green Deal. If we look at the ambitions more broadly on climate change, I think it's with direction we should go. But I think we need to wake up to the fact that this is going to be extraordinarily expensive to deliver in different member states. And that many of these ambitions don't sit comfortably with sort of energy policy developments, with other type of market developments which is not underpinning the notion that we can wean ourselves off fossil fuels at the speed we are supposed to do. And of course we're already seeing right now with farmers' demonstrations in Amsterdam, in Berlin, around Paris now, many other parts of Europe as well. But this is going to come in other sectors too, because we're not connecting the dots between what we have in terms of targets, what we have in terms of intra-European emission allocation mechanisms, and what is required on the ground in order to deliver this. And I think this is an area where there is fundamental public support for the overall orientation, but I think we need to be extraordinarily awake to the fact that we have now sitting in terms of delivery implementation, a process which can lead to extraordinary divergence in Europe in the single market simply because countries are going to choose very different ways of doing it.
Mm. And this is a very interesting point in terms of sort of the real price tag for some of the big ambitions, but also the state aid rules as well. And I think, Alexei, it would be very good because we've been hearing a little bit already about sort of the leadership role for the European Commission, the need to make and take more of an active role as the guardian of the single market, or whatever we want to call it, Dirk, in the future, which is more appropriate. But is there more needed to be done to rein in some of the member states and maybe some of the disparities that are coming through at the moment?
Well, I think that if we take a horizontal view of the single market and of the role that it plays maybe in the election that is upcoming. We value we only learn what we value when it goes away. So if we think about what happened a few years ago across the British Channel, I think we learned a lot about how much actually the single market is valuable for us. It's almost like the air we breathe, we just don't notice it. The fact that most of the products on our shelves of our supermarkets are coming from other member states, the currency we use, the fact that we don't have to show passport when we cross borders, all of those things, we take them for granted. And so in that sense, if we want to have a new narrative, it has to be, in a sense, an old narrative also, just focusing on the very valuable and very tangible things that already exist. Now, in terms of how we go forward, I think that indeed the catalogization of barriers or of obstacles has, in a sense, already happened. We know very well what are the problems that we are facing. And so I think now is the time for new ideas, and not just ideas in a broad scale, but more detailed, concrete policy ideas. So I think in that sense, the timing of the two reports that are coming up, the Letta report that is just before the election and the Draghi report that will be after the election, is very carefully chosen to sort of take into account the current mood in the debate, and also to contribute to the debate with concrete policy ideas. And I would call for this more detailed policy proposals also from the business community, because I think that this is something that, well, of course, not a direct input, is always very useful in the discussions that we have in the European institutions also, to understand very well what original ideas coming from the business community.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's a good point that you say in terms of the call out to business there, but also as we're seeing sort of with the elections coming as well, potentially more fragmentation, more polarization as well, and the elements that this could bring into the discussions. And could the single market be a casualty of this? Martinez, what would you say to this point?
Thanks, Glenn. I'm happy to hear that the Commission is still open to any proposal from the business community. Just a reminder, 37 proposals, recommendations from Business Europe are out there in November. And we are ready to give more. In terms of can the single market be a casualty, I think yes, and I wanted to pick on what Frederick was talking about what is also around the single market policies. I think we should not make a mistake and also create the impression to people that the single market will solve all the economic challenges, security challenges, geopolitical tensions and whatnot, because it is not meant to, and it has not been designed for that reason. So at least in our view, single market is about the 4 freedoms that are guaranteed by the treaties. Which means we cannot blame the single market for all the bad things happening. We have just to, patiently work on it, and also maybe communicate to the policymakers and the society at large that single market will not deliver what it should and could without additional things that are within the competence of the member states. And I'm speaking of structural reforms. I mean, take the labor market. I mean, take all the tensions around, the skills gap, all the tensions around the social dumping. It's still there. I'm surprised. I mean, we negotiated Services Directive how many years ago? 2005 it was adopted, I think. We are still talking about the social dumping. And that's because we, as Europeans, are failing with the labor market reforms. And I hope in the coming 20 years, maybe we will get there. But I mean, for me, that's a shame that we haven't delivered on that. So, yes, the single market may be a casualty, but we have options how to deal with it and to avoid that.
And Dirk, you as well. I mean, you were sort of alluding to this already. There are potential challenges that are coming up here as well. Anything specifically we need to sort of think about to be able to address some of those already now going into the perceived polarization and fragmentation that we'll see after June?
Well, I think the one of the principles of the single market is also solidarity. I think sometimes we forget about that, and I think especially when you talk about more protectionism, more populism that we can expect after the elections. Like I think I'm from a rural area. I'm from a very agricultural region that where people have massively voted in the last elections for right-wing populist parties. And even though we're, like my village is 10 kilometers from the border and we do shopping across borders and we get fuel in another country. And so just to say that a lot of people in those regions, and I'm just not only talking about that region, but others, feel that they are not connected enough to the European project. And then we were talking about state aid. I think at a country level has even felt sometimes like that the big countries are dominating. And we've honestly also seen that even in sort of the way that also the Commission, and that's not so much criticism to the services level, but more to the political level, have gone about being the guardian of the treaty. When big countries like France or Italy or Germany would come with national initiatives, it's very difficult for the Commission politically to go against that. More difficult than when a small country comes with those rules. So I think we have to make sure that the single market continues to be that glue that also keeps all of the countries, regions, different levels together. And that's why I think we need to now have a discussion about investing in a European infrastructure. So things like the energy market, where still a lot of room of improvement can be made to harmonize and to coordinate, but also digital. These are the fundamentals for us as a sector then to make sure that we do not have any supply chain issues, that we continue to be competitive, that we can operate on the global market as one single block. That is going to be absolutely critical.
And Frederick, just on this point here, when you were talking very much before about sort of the state aid rules, and there's things that are already bubbling under which are causing these problems. Will this be turbocharged after the elections with maybe more sort of extremist groups there, or will this just sort of be continuation of what we're seeing already?
I don't think so. So let me just preface what I'm now going to say with just a short story. The first election I ever participated in my constituency, there was a result which created a lot of surprise because I grew up in a constituency that usually voted left. And suddenly there was one vote coming from someone who had voted for the Liberal Party. And people started to figure out, who on earth voted for the Liberal Party? Well, that was me. In that constituency now, there is hardly anyone voting for the left. They're voting for what is called the Sweden Democrats, which is the nationalist populist party in Sweden. If I look at the current setup of the European Parliament, and if my only priority would be to protect the single market, I would prefer the Sweden Democrats to the French Liberals, because they have a more consistent voting record of supporting single market reforms and avoiding the type of interventions that make it harder to have an open European market. If you look, for instance, at votes on regulations and regulations that tend to have an impact on single markets, well, they actually tend to vote in more sort of, for want of a better term, pro-business direction than French liberals. So perhaps it's Macron we should be worried about and not the Sweden Democrats. I'm, of course, provoking you now, because the only priority isn't the single market. There's a lot of other things that are of importance as well. My point would be that I don't think these nationalist populists are one single group. I think there are huge varieties between them. If you, like me, think, for instance, that gender rights, abortion are important, well, There are some parties to worry about in this group. There are other parties we don't need to worry about. So they want to go in the complete opposite direction and let loose the sale of human organs and sort of liberalize markets for anything related to the human body and sort of create a market from it. There are more connections in economic terms between Viktor Orban and Thierry Breton than it is between Geert Wilders and Thierry Breton, or Viktor Orban. So they are very, very different. I don't think we should expect that they're going to have a majority in the next parliament. I think the centrist parties will be able to scrape together a majority. I'm less convinced that these parties will provide the basis for political leadership on the issues that we need to see leadership on. I mean, look, my institute, we publish around 70 papers a year. I would really, really like the notion that one more paper is going to change the fate of the single market in the European Union, because if that was true, my God, I have things to contribute. What I think is not the papers that are missing, it's the political leadership.
Yeah.
And whether we're going to have political leaders that are willing to go in a better direction, well, that remains to be seen. It can change. And it can change very, very fast. So people in democratic elections have now an opportunity to say what they think. Member state governments have an opportunity to say what they think, and hopefully they're going to choose a different direction in the next 5 years compared to what we had in the past 5 years.
Excellent. Well, thanks for those inputs. And Alexei, just moving this on now to more sort of the global trade relations element as well, because the single market is not just a useful thing for the EU, but of course, as we were hearing earlier on, also in terms of trade relations with major global players like the United States, like China. This is a great carrot that's put out there, a huge bargaining chip in terms of access to the single market. And, you know, we've seen kind of this more isolationism, more of a fortress Europe over recent times, a move away from the global supply chains. But, you know, what are your thoughts here about sort of resetting that narrative as well, and actually sort of the internal market outwards as well as just being within the European Union's borders?
Well, I think the single market is indeed a very important, let's say, export of the European Union. There is the Brussels effect that is well known, that around 20% of standards that we adopt are adopted by our trade partners. And so indeed, it is a huge boon for those who want to trade with us. I think that nevertheless, there has been a major change in geopolitical environment. And so in that sense, we have to make sure that there is a degree of independence, or there is a degree of self-reliance that also exists in the single market. And so in that direction, we have worked a lot on identifying our strategic dependencies and tackling that. So I'm not sure that necessarily it's a question of narrative as such. I think it's a question of putting in place a policy that takes into account all of those conflicting priorities. And there is no running away from that. Perhaps just one reflection to what the previous speakers have said. I think that I would not also expect that there would necessarily be a move towards protectionism, even if there is going to be a move to the right in the next European Parliament. But if there is such a move, of course, during COVID we had restrictions, trade restrictions also inside Europe. We had export restrictions imposed by certain member states. And there are ways of tackling those restrictions which we implemented during COVID on informal, through informal contacts, but also by putting in place systems to deal with that. So I stop here.
Yep, Alexei, well, thank you very much indeed, and great feedback from the panel. Want them to sit here, and also maybe Craig, if you can join the panel as well, because we're going to open up discussions to the floor. We have some wireless microphones here as well. So before you state your question, if you can say your name and the organisation that you represent, and you also who you want to address the question to, or if it's just sort of generally, please be my guest. So who wants to kick things off in this sense?
Yes, so my name is Joanna Inglis. I'm from Eurocommerce, and it's really to extend that last question a little bit about where you think we'll be in 5 years' time, given what we know about the outcomes of the future EU elections. So would you say we will be better off in terms of the way the single market functions, worse off, or 50-50?
Who wants to take that first? Go on, Craig.
Is it working?
Yeah.
I'm going to sidestep making a direct answer to your question, unsurprisingly, and then other people can do the same. But I mean, there is hope, right? I mean, I think as everyone agrees in terms of where the single market is, yeah, the last 5 years have been sort of lost time for some unavoidable reasons. No matter what leadership we had in the last 5 years, it would have been a hard period, and then perhaps for some blameful reasons, if you will, that more could have been done. Yeah, I mean, the European Parliament elections, it seems unlikely to me that they are going to help a whole lot in that respect. But there are a number of possible outcomes that could allow for a number of possible commissions in particular, right? And so, I mean, there is still a moment here, I think, where interventions from people here in this room and elsewhere can do their best, right, to sort of push the single market back up onto the agenda. And so, you know, the Letter report and the Draghi report, these are people trying to do that and an opportunity to sort of magnify that voice. You know, I think that I'll go way out on a limb here. So after dodging a direct answer, you know, there are all these demands on the EU to act and add resources and capacity in all sorts of new ways that it hasn't done in the past. There is this old single market goal, which is about a zone of peace and prosperity and less action, really. There is at least the potential, if lots of things go right and some things don't go wrong, for a package deal across those things, right? That some people are going to get some of their expanded EU capacities and resources in a number of ways, and the people who are really champions of the single market will say, yeah, well, we'll go along with that given X, Y, and Z as an upgrade or a sort of reinvigoration of the single market. So that's the most optimistic thing I can say.
Martinez, please.
Thanks. I will quickly start with a bit of history. In 2019, before the President Commission was taking the office, we also had some recommendations. And having arrived in 2024, we did a check. I will not tell the result, but it's not very encouraging. But that brings me to a more positive message. I think that, yeah, in 5 years, we have to be better off with the single market, and I believe that we will be. And sometimes it does require a bit of belief as well. And I also see a change of narrative in the political landscape already. So reports aside, papers will not do the job, but we see that politicians are also already aware of the issues that Europe is facing in terms of competitiveness, and I think President von der Leyen as well was very clear about that. So I am optimistic because I do see a change in narrative, and I see a new direction coming in.
Excellent. Anyone else like to take that one up? Anyone else want to take that? Oh, no, please. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Carol. I will not take 4 minutes. Promise, not 4 minutes. I'm José Ramón Fernández, Pernod Ricard. I'm a proud members of Spirits Europe and also Food Drink Europe. And thank you very much, actually, for organizing this excellent and inspiring conversation. I would just like, because I understand, and building on your last point from Business Europe, I think definitely, if we go through the full list of queries we have for improving concretely in every different, across the sectors, the internal market, we could actually spend here, like, 1 month, okay? But let me just elaborate on 3 concrete things, and just to check if you find this to be feasible or not, because they are supposed to be simple elements that could actually greatly improve the internal market, certainly for companies or sectors like ours. First one is, if we legislate with a regulation at European level, it should be a regulation, not a directive. So we have seen a proliferation of regulatory initiatives, regulations, that actually they go to the Council, to the Parliament, and at the end of the day, you have a clause saying member states can go beyond that. So what the hell, we need to have a regulation supposed to be fully harmonized at European level, but then every member state can go whatever they want beyond that level playing field. This is certainly not helping us to have a legibility, a clear clarity in terms of the functional internal market. So if you make a directive, they make a directive, but if we go for a regulation, every member state, everyone should respect this regulation fully harmonized at European level with no possibilities to diverge in terms of actual implementation at national level. Second is linked to this one. If an area where actually there is a regulation harmonization at European level, one member state consider that they can go unilaterally on a standard that actually is going to stop the internal market to work for this particular market, by principle, the European Union should play the role of guardian and say, listen, this is not possible to accept because you are not accepting the rules of the game. If you want this to be solved, we need to get together, harmonize rule for the internal market. But we could not allow, as it has been the case over the last years, to have every country deciding unilaterally a measure that is completely adopts with a fully harmonized area at European Union level in a regulation. For instance, labeling, okay? And then the third one is another that's, I would say it looks like relatively simple, which is, digital transformation has been one of the top policy objectives of the transformation of the European Union over the last 5 years. Digital has been very much about the European Union putting stuff on rules, on regulations, but there has not been able to liberate, to give the possibility to develop digital solutions, modern solutions that are internal market friendly for consumer information purposes. Very difficult to make stakeholders understand that consumers and users are more and more looking digitally to all the information they need. And now with the artificial intelligence stuff, it will be the normal thing to do. There is no way to get recognition at European level that we need to bet and to open to digital labeling, digital consumer information as part of the policy mix that allows consumers to be properly informed. Could we have a chance over the next term to see enthusiastically European Union, European Commission embracing these possibilities? Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anyone want to come back on the point there, or just support and applaud?
I fully agree, José Ramon. If I would have said something different, then he would withdraw membership, probably. No, but I think these are the kind of discussions that need to be held, and need to be held also at the highest political level, because you have to start from the principle. A lot of the member states have committed on paper to these kind of things, but not in practice. So it needs to start not in the Compet committee, not in the competitiveness committee, where you have a council, where you have the ministers of industry, etc. But really the European leaders that need to, for once and for all, set the necessary guidelines or principles or whatever you have, and like whether you start with a regulation by default, and only if there is a real good justification you deviate from it. The same if you cannot avoid that something is a national competence, that you do a proper impact assessment on whether consumer protection or public health protection or anything like that is absolutely justified. I think that needs to be addressed. But we see that in practice, countries are politically misusing or abusing the absence of EU rules as a reason to legislate, to make sure that their local or their national population is satisfied by them taking a symbolic action. And I think that all is prevented by having first a proper discussion. So I hope that this Letta and Draghi exercise, that will also address these very critical principal questions that need to be answered now. And then we can be optimistic.
We've got time for another question as well. Please, yes, just here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kim Watts from the American Chamber of Commerce to the European Union. First of all, just like to thank the panel for a really, really interesting discussion, and thank you for the interesting research presented. Thinking about this, I'd love the panel's reaction to the risk of protectionism slipping in as we talk about a refresh and renewal of the single market, of whatever we want to call it, particularly if that refresh and renew tends to focus on boosting, European homegrown companies and champions. And I think that obviously our organization represents companies that have a long history, American companies have a long history of investing in Europe, they're big employers, very committed to the single market. And that risk of protectionism towards European champions slipping into the, as we refresh and renew, rather than it being about an open and level playing field that has been so successful for so many years.
Anyone would like to take that one? Frederick?
Yes, I'm happy to chip in. I think the first thing I'd say, so protectionism is here already. So it's not that we're talking about the threat of it coming, it's already here. And we're seeing it growing in Europe, but we're seeing it growing in other parts of the world. On the corporate side, I think we have to be careful, because when we're saying we want to create a European champion, let's be clear what we're talking about. We're not talking about an Estonian champion, or a Polish champion, or a Swedish champion, or a Danish champion, or a Dutch champion, or a Belgian champion. We're talking about either a German champion or a French champion. That's what we're talking about. And that's what a lot of the industrial policy ambitions that go towards these policies are about. We're already sort of on track when you look at the distribution of state aid, which isn't just about trying to compensate for higher energy costs and that sort of things, but the actual allocation of where money goes, that's where it's going. And I think this is going to cause reactions, and it's going to cause reactions from competing firms in other parts of Europe, because they are the ones who are feeling the brunt of the unfairness more thoroughly than any American firm or firm from other parts of the world when these things are happening. And this is one of the things I'm fearful about, that we may not be very, very far away from EU member state governments starting to take action against other because they think the subsidy intensity is creating unfairnesses that they're not prepared to accept. So this I would definitely be worried about. Now the other question is, so how can you create competitive growth for companies? And here I'm struggling to really understand where we're going. For the last 25, 30 years, when we talked about what we want to achieve in firm size distribution, we talked about SMEs and SME growth. It's been a strong political premium of creating opportunities for SMEs to grow faster and to grow faster, grow bigger at a faster clip than they've done in the past. Now it seems we are flipping the coin, and we are now looking at bigness as one of the criteria for what we think competitiveness is. And I think we've been perhaps taking the wrong lessons from some of the large American companies when it comes to if it's bigness itself which is creating competitiveness, or if it's something else. And I would like us to focus on that something else again, because that's where I think the growth capacity for firms are. That's where I think it's necessary for already large firms to grow larger if that's part of the competitive strategy. And that entails spending more resources on R&D, on spending more resources on investment, on being closer to the frontier of global technological change, regardless what sectors that you are operating in. And that's what I would like to see in terms of focus of European policies, and I think we can achieve a lot if we do the right things there. But that's not about bigness per se, or about trying to create champions. It's much more about, as you say, leveling the playing field. And we shake these things, and then we see who falls off and who are ready to sort of be capable of competing globally. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank all the members of the panel and Craig as well once again for their fantastic inputs. A stimulating debate, but also at the same time as well, lots of food for thought that Alexei can take back to the letter report in terms of how to make sure this gets traction and doesn't sit on the shelf gathering dust. So the input's there, and you'll be receiving this as well to bring that forward. And now, without further ado, Carol, I believe there's a bar waiting to be attacked.